Hi and welcome back to Quadrant channel. So in this deep dive video, we'll be closely looking at Microsoft Fabric workspace level private links. So private links kind of provide a secure private connection between your virtual network, corporate virtual network, and Microsoft Fabric workspaces, blocking public internet access to your data and try and reduce the risk of unauthorized access or data breaches itself. And Azure Private Link and Azure Networking Private Endpoints, both are used to send data traffic privately using Microsoft backbone network infrastructure instead of going across the public internet, right? So, but let's try and look at this demo end to end to see how we can set up such workspace level private links to kind of bring down the entire public access for your workspace, right? So that you'll have restricted access to your workspace only through the virtual network. So let's get started. So let's quickly look at the business problem solution and benefits, right? So with respect to workspace level private links. And I think if you haven't watched the other video related to outbound access protection from workspace, and that's a different topic on the outbound side, probably would encourage you to probably have a quick look at the other video that we already published in channel related to outbound access protection. But this is purely on the inbound networking side. We can see how we can restrict access to the workspace and then only through private endpoints, having those secured access to your workspace through VNet, right? So within the VNet, without crossing the boundary and exposing your data to public internet. So that's the whole idea of this deep dive video. So enterprises adopting Fabric, they must comply with strict network security and compliance policies. No compromise in that. So Fabric workspaces by default are reachable over the public internet, right? So that increases the risk of exposure. So IP allow lists, you can also do the configuration and then allow some IPs to reach your workspace, but that still leave an attack surface and don't satisfy private only access mandates. So many organizations require Fabric access only via corporate networks, right? So I hope all of you can relate to, right? So through their VNets, VPN and Express route. So they wanted to kind of protect their data with no direct public exposure at all. And that's exactly what we are going to look at in this deep dive video to try and help you to understand how we can do this kind of a setup end to end. So the solution is you can implement workspace level private link in Microsoft Fabric, and you can bind the workspace to an Azure private endpoint inside the customer's Azure VNet itself, right? So you need to explicitly create a private endpoint and then bind your workspace to that using private link servers within Fabric. And we are going to do all of that in Azure, creating those private link servers, private endpoints, and then binding your workspace to private endpoint inside the VNet. So all of those steps are going to be covered in this video. So it'll be a detailed deep dive video, right? So at the end of this video, you'll have clear understanding on how you need to set up workspace level private link in Microsoft Fabric. And I think we can use workspace communication policy API to deny public access to workspace. I think otherwise, even now we have the support. I think this was probably at the preview stage, we had to do it in API way to restrict deny the public access. Now, I think in Fabric workspace settings, you can go ahead and apply a few settings at a click of a button. I think you can deny public access to your workspace, and your workspace will be completely restricted. You cannot even access through public internet. So you can only access it through programmatic way with an API from within the virtual network, probably from within virtual machine. Okay, so that we will probably we can finally validate how we can do a nslookup to the fully qualified domain name that we are going to set up, and that should resolve to the private IP, right? So that you can securely access workspace from within virtual machine sitting inside the virtual network. Okay, so that's the solution we are aiming for. And the benefits, what are the benefits? So that workspace level private links reduce attack surface, right? So it directly removes that public exposure of your workspace. So it's completely restricted now. So only within the virtual network. Maybe you might be having your virtual machine sitting in that virtual network. So you can try and access the data from your workspace from within the virtual machine sitting inside the same virtual network. Okay, so that's the kind of demo that we are looking at in this video. And zero trust alignment enforces access strictly through private network paths and controlled entry points. And compliance readiness, it helps meet private connectivity and restricted ingress requirements as well. And secure integrations, programmatic API traffic flows securely through VNet, as we mentioned, so improving your governance and control posture as well. So standardized enterprise pattern, so repeatable approach across your workspaces for consistent security posture across your entire organization. So that's your solution for the business problem that we looked at, and the benefits that you would get by implementing workspace level private link in Microsoft Fabric. Okay, let's get into the demo. Okay, before we dive into the demo with the number of steps to implement this, so let us try and understand the architecture, right? How it works. So in this architectural diagram for workspace level private link, you can see there are quite a few workspaces that you already have in tenant, imagine. And for a few workspaces, the inbound public access is actually denied, and for a couple of workspaces, it is allowed. Okay, and I think you can see here right within the Azure platform, you need to go ahead and create those private link services for your workspaces. And private link service for workspace kind of maps your virtual network to Fabric workspace, right? So that's the service that you need to create to keep the traffic in the Microsoft backbone virtual network, right? So essentially, I think you can have kind of a one-to-one relationship between the private link service to workspace, right? So you cannot have more than one private link service attached to a single workspace. So as you can see here, we have different private link services established or created in Azure for different workspaces here. And for the fourth workspace, we don't have any private link service as such. But you have a couple of virtual networks here, VNet A and VNet B, as you can see here, where you have private endpoints. So I think how you can establish connection to these Fabric workspaces. So once you create those private link service for the workspace in Azure, then I think you need to create those required private endpoints, okay, with the private link service resource IDs, right? So that's how you can try and establish the connection from within the, let's say, a virtual machine within this virtual network A can talk to your Fabric workspace, right? So you essentially create that private endpoint. So all of the resources sitting within the virtual network, probably be it the virtual machine, and then if you're trying to access Fabric workspace from within the virtual machine sitting in this VNet A or VNet B, then you need to have those private endpoints, and you need to try and create those private endpoints to establish the connectivity using the private link service to workspace. And that's how the architecture works. And also, if you can closely look at it, you have a couple of private endpoints, one in VNet A and VNet B, as you can see here, that we have created, that is mapped to one single private link service for the workspace one, right? So the relationship here is you can have multiple private endpoints in different virtual networks created, that is mapped to one single private link service for workspace one, and both I think virtual machines from both the virtual networks via these private endpoints can kind of talk to the Fabric workspaces using this private link service for workspace one. Okay, so that is one kind of implementation that you can think of. And I think here you can see for private link service for workspace 2, we have a dedicated private endpoint that's created under virtual network B, that's establishing the connection to workspace 2, right? So where we have the restriction applied already, right? So the inbound public access is already denied. So that's how you can look at it, right? So essentially there are few steps that you need to implement, like in Azure portal, you need to go ahead and create those private link services. and for your workspace by pulling the required workspace object ID, and then create those private link services in Azure. So all of these steps we are going to try and implement and showcase end to end as a part of this deep dive video. Okay, so I think the private endpoints is the kind of connector that you can say it essentially, you can say, brings your workspaces into the virtual network, right? So whenever you create a private endpoint, you map it to private link service that you created in Azure for workspace one using the resource ID. Then I think it will effectively bring the workspace, right, so into your virtual network. So then I think you can try and access the workspace from within the virtual network itself, right? So maybe it could be you may be having virtual machines, multiple virtual machines sitting in this virtual network A and B, as you can see here. And I think you can try and access the workspaces using this private endpoint and private link services that you created to securely access the workspaces in Fabric, and then probably in a programmatic way, API way, that you can access and probably try and access the data and then start implementation, okay, around that. So in a way, we are trying to secure the entire connectivity to Fabric workspaces, as we are completely blocking the inbound public access. So we have some admin level settings that we need to enable as a prerequisites, which we will quickly go through. But once you deny the public access, the workspace is going to be completely restricted. Let me show you that real quickly. So this is the workspace in my Fabric account. As you can see, we have this private workspace, and you can see this notification. The access is completely restricted to this workspace, since we have already denied the public access at this workspace level. So the only way I can get to this workspace is through resources from within my virtual network, right? So maybe from you may be having implemented already a virtual machine sitting in your virtual network. So you need to create those private endpoints, private link services for workspace, and then try and establish connection to your Fabric workspace, probably in a programmatic way using APIs, right? So that's how you can access the data once you restrict the public inbound access for your Fabric workspaces. Okay, so that's what the architecture is all about. So I think we are going to implement this step by step. So the first step, I think we can provide you the link, Microsoft documentation link, in the description if you want to go through the entire set of steps, what I'm going to demonstrate here. But basically, there are some prerequisites that we need to be aware, and there are some considerations and limitations which you need to be aware before you go ahead and enable this or deny the public access for your workspace to restrict the inbound public access. And then the second step would be to create those private link servers in Azure with the help of the workspace object ID that you're going to create. And then I think you will need to procure those required virtual networks. Just for demonstration, we are going to do that, maybe 1 VNet, and then we will start creating those private endpoints, which picks up, which needs to be mapped to the private link service that you created for the workspace. That will effectively bring the workspace, Fabric workspace, within this virtual network, right? So that's the idea of creating those private endpoints to effectively bring the Fabric workspace under the virtual network. Then I think all the resources that are within this virtual networks, right? Or if you're talking about workspace one, then all of the resources sitting within this virtual network can securely access the Fabric workspace. Okay, and that's the whole idea, and probably from the architectural point of view, how we are implementing this moving forward. Okay, so a few more points before we get into the actual demo. So I think private endpoint, you can think of it as like, kind of a connector that you're trying to establish connection from your virtual network resources to Fabric workspace. So I think under the hood, it will try and allocate a specific IP address within the range that you have already defined within the virtual network, right? So you might have already defined a specific range. So what private endpoint will do is it will go ahead and pick up one specific address, and then it will try and effectively bring the workspace within the virtual network itself using the private link service. And that's all we are trying to do with private endpoint, right? So probably you might have heard about managed private endpoints. That's something managed totally by Microsoft, but I think here we are not kind of going to create those managed private endpoints, essentially in ADF, Azure Data Factory, or even in outbound access protection. We have when we try to prevent exfiltration to internet, we in the other video we demonstrated how you can create those managed private endpoints within Workspace. So that all the virtual network provisioning or the allocation of IP, everything will be taken care by Microsoft. Okay, so here it is something we will go ahead and create a virtual network, and then it's not a managed private endpoint. We will create a private endpoint that will allocate a specific IP address for this private link service to establish that connection from your virtual network to Fabric Workspace. And notice this third workspace, right? So what you can see here. So as you can see, the inbound public access is allowed for Workspace 3, and also we have a private endpoint in VNet B, as you can see here, which is kind of linking the machines within the, or effectively bringing the Workspace 3 under the virtual network, so that machines under the virtual network B can kind of establish that connection to Workspace 3 in case if you need to pull the data and access the workspace and perform some operations using the APIs, right? So that's how you can look at it. But I think ideally this is kind of a testing scenario that you can use in an enterprise kind of a scenario. This is not recommended because you're also allowing the public access and then having a private endpoint to establish that connection to your workspace, right, using private endpoint and private link service. So I think this is probably for testing purposes, but ideally when you need to probably go ahead and deny the public access and then establish that connectivity to effectively bring the workspace under the virtual network to securely access the data products within the workspace, right? So securely from within the virtual network. Okay, so let's get into demo, or before we get into demo, let's talk about prerequisites and considerations and limitations real quickly. Okay, so before we get into prerequisites and some of the considerations and limitations, right? So we talked about securing the workspace and then accessing it only through virtual machine sitting within the virtual network, right? And the way you can access this is you need to use the fully qualified domain name, FQDN, right? So when you try and access the workspace from within the virtual machine in case, right? And I think we will go through the format probably at the end of this video when we do the nslookup to try and see if that resolves to private IP after the complete setup is done throughout the demo. But I think it's something like you will pick up the workspace ID, and then that will be like, I'll tell you how exactly you can pick up the workspace ID from Fabric. But that object ID you need to pick up without dashes, and then XY here represents the first two characters of the object ID itself, right? And I think you can see multiple links that are available here for OneLake, TFS, Blob, which you can take a look to be aware of the kind of FQDNs that you need to construct to access the workspace once the access is restricted, right, for your workspace. So I think if you come back to Fabric, right on top of the URL, for this specific workspace, you can see after groups / you can pick up the workspace ID from there. Okay, so that's your unique identifier for your workspace. In my case, the restricted workspace, I can pick up the unique identity for that specific workspace. Yeah, that's your object ID. Okay, so let's dive into some of the prerequisites that you need to be aware before we go ahead and get this setup done. So you need to be aware of a couple of settings that you need to enable, and for doing that, you need to be a Fabric administrator. You need to have that required role to enable a couple of settings at the tenant level, right? So what are those two settings, right? So at the tenant level, you need to, as I mentioned, I think you need to have the required permissions to get into the admin portal and tenant level settings. And these are the couple of settings that you need to enable, right? So I cannot show these in Fabric because I have restricted access. I don't have the required role to show that, but that's fine. But you need to be aware of what are the required settings that you need to enable, right? So one is the configuration of workspace level inbound network rules. That you need to be aware or enable it. And if you don't have required permissions, you need to contact Fabric administrator and then ensure these settings are enabled for you to implement the workspace level private links. Okay, so this is one of the setting that needs to be enabled, probably for specific users or at the organizational level that you need to design, right? And the other setting that you need to enable is configuration of the workspace IP firewall rules as well. Apart from setting up the private links, you can also kind of whitelist some of the IPs, right? So that is also possible. But I think that will still leave some attack surface, right? So that's the reason I think maybe you need to try and deny the entire inbound public access. Probably can allow some IPs if you want, or bring down the entire workspace and then securely access from within VNet only. Okay, so probably inside of your virtual machine. Okay, so these two are the settings that you need to enable to make sure we are ready to probably go ahead and implement further. Okay. And let's look at the considerations and limitations, right? So let's go through that quickly. So what are the kind of items that are supported, right? So when you enable workspace level private link, and then if you're trying to access some of the items within the Fabric workspace, so once you have the private link activated, I think you can connect to all of these item types within your workspace. It could be Lakehouse, SQL endpoint shortcut, direct connection via OneLake endpoint, copy job, mounted data factory, data flow gen 2, mirror database, event stream, event house for your RTA use cases, right? And what about the unsupported types at the moment is like you cannot go ahead and build deployment pipelines and default semantic models as well, right? So, but otherwise, I think the list for supported items are a lot that you can leverage, and it needs to be, right? So once you completely restrict the workspace, you need to, if you're trying to access any of the item types within the workspace, and you should know the kind of supported item types at the moment. Okay. And what are some of the limitations? Let's quickly go through the limitations to try and understand. I think there are some limitations. The limit of private endpoints for a workspace that you can go create is like up to 100, and the limit of workspace private link servers you can create per tenant is close to 500. So I think you can quickly go through it, the kind of limitations that you need to be aware. And also the critical requirement is you cannot try and implement this with the trial capacity, right? So you need to be in a Fabric paid capacity. Even the premium SKU is not supported, right? So you need to be in FSKU to implement this. Okay, so okay, you can go through all of the limitations. Okay, so you can have up to 10 workspace private link services can be created per minute, but there are some limitations that you can go through quickly. We will probably provide the documentation link in the chat or in the description so that you can quickly go through those. Okay, there are some common errors and troubleshooting that you can go through it, but without any further delay, let's dive into the demo steps itself. Okay, now let's get into the demo and try and talk about different steps, right? So there are multiple steps that you need to make sure to implement to enable this private link for workspace working. So let's go through it one by one. So as a part of step one, right? So you'll actually create a workspace, and probably you have the workspace ready, and then if you wanted to make sure you deny the public access for this specific workspace, or even before denying the public access, that could be a last step as well. But I think you can get the other steps done and then you can do it as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily you need to deny the public access and then go ahead with your private link service creation in Azure. But let me quickly show you. So this workspace that we are looking at, I'm within the Fabric portal. So this is the private workspace that we have already restricted, right? So the inbound public access has been completely restricted for this workspace. So I cannot even get into workspace settings, as you can see here. And let me quickly show you how we can deny the public access, as a step one. So let me get into my other workspace real quick, or the MCT workspace that I have here. And let me get into workspace settings. And when you get into the workspace settings, you can find a couple of networking related actions that you can do. One is outbound networking, which we have already done a detailed video on that. If you want, you can go ahead and look at it in Quadrant channel. The concept that we are working or trying to implement here is the inbound networking, right? So the second one. So where you can have some information here. So when the workspace private links are included, when either option is selected, yeah, if you select the allow connections from, so there are a couple of actions as you can see here, right? So under workspace connection settings, so either you can allow connections to this workspace including private links, which means it's a hybrid kind of a setup, right? So which will not completely limit or restrict the inbound public access, right? So that's the setting that we have by default, right? But I think when you want to completely restrict the access, as we have seen in the other workspace, which is private workspace, where you cannot access any of the items over the public internet, then I think you can switch back to this setting, which is allowing connections from only selected networks and workspace level private links, which we are going to create. Okay, and I think you have to be really careful when enabling this for your workspace. Otherwise, I think your workspace will be completely locked, right? So when you enable this, and then the only way you can access your workspace is through the workspace level private link, or from selected networks, or even from selected networks when I'm not enabling it. So when you choose that, you can also allow whitelist some of the IPs, right? So as you can see here in the address configurations, you can go ahead and edit and then permit some of the users from public addresses as well. Okay, that you can do, and also the workspace level private links. But you need to make sure before you go ahead and apply the setting, which will kind of restrict the workspace from inbound public access, completely denying the public access. So you need to make sure you also configure the address configuration, if you want to whitelist any of the IPs, right? So before you go ahead and apply the setting. So here you can go ahead and start adding those IP addresses, public IP addresses that you would want to whitelist and allow, right? So that you can add here and then go ahead with it. But I'm not going to demonstrate for this workspace. I think most of the steps are already done to showcase end-to-end. So I'm just going to go through the steps that you need to take, and what are the kind of settings that you need to make, and then we will go through the steps one by one. Okay, so this is the kind of setting that you need to enable to deny the inbound access completely, right? But I think also trying and permitting some of the IPs, public IPs, in case if you want, right? So that's not mandatory as such. If you want, you can do it. Otherwise, completely block the public access, not even whitelisting some of the IPs, and then the only way to get to workspace is through workspace private links. Okay, so let me cancel this. Yeah, so the default, as you can see here with some information, they're saying the workspace private link is included in both the option, right? So even if you're kind of allowing all of the connections to this workspace, even you can go ahead and create a private link, and then also allow the connections from within the virtual network as well, along with the public access. Okay, so let me close this and come back to Azure portal. So our second step would be to go ahead and create private link service, okay, for workspace. So how do we go about and do it? Okay, so the way you can do it is in Azure portal, you can search for private link. Yeah, private link services, right? So you can go ahead and click on it, and that takes you to Network Foundation. So you can go ahead and create a private link service, or the other way of doing it is you can do a custom deployment, right? So let me show you how we can do a custom deployment, right? So let me say custom deployment in the search, and you can see there is a deploy a custom deployment, right? So custom template. So click on that, and that should take you to custom deployment, where you can go ahead and build your own template in the editor. Okay, I'm going to click on that, and that takes me to the editor. You can clean this, Control A and delete. Okay, and I want you to probably will share the documentation steps in the description as well. But I think you need to pick up this code. So okay, so let me just quickly pick up this JSON and show you what exactly you need to configure to create those private links for workspace. Okay, let me copy this and come back to Azure portal. Okay, so basically we have some resources configured here, right? The type, as you can see here, the type of the private link is private link services for Fabric under Microsoft.Fabric resource provider. Okay, so before we do this, let me show you one other thing, right? So that is also a prerequisite which you need to make sure in Azure to make sure you register the Microsoft.Fabric resource provider as well. And the way you would do it is go to subscriptions and get into your subscription, whatever you have. And on the left plate, you can navigate to resource providers. Yeah, I'm highlighting that. Get into resource providers and search for Microsoft.Fabric. So there is a separate resource provider, as you can see here, for Microsoft Fabric, and that is already registered. In case if it is not registered, you need to make sure you're registering the resource provider, right? So to enable the required APIs to implement the private link service. Okay. So let me come back to the template. So you can see the type already under this resource provider. We are having private link services for Fabric and the API version, and you can provide the name for your private link service. And there are a couple of properties that you need to configure. One is the tenant ID, your organization tenant ID, and the workspace ID. So let me show you exactly how we can do that, right? So you can give some name like Fabric private link or something like that, right? Fabric-private link, and tenant ID, you can pick it from your Azure Entra. So let me show you how you can pick it up. So in your Entra ID, which is your Active Directory, so you can pick up the tenant ID right from here, right? So in the home page in Entra tenant, so you can copy that and provide the Entra tenant ID that you have here, and the workspace ID. How you can pick up the workspace ID? So we have already discussed on that. So you can pick up the workspace ID for the workspace that you need to restrict and then create those private links, right? So you can go back to a private underscore workspace, and you can copy the object ID for this workspace, right? So that will go exactly there. Okay, so you can copy that and bring it to this template. Okay, and that's how you would do it to make sure you do the required configuration like tenant ID and workspace ID. Okay, and also you can name it as well, right? So whatever the private link you wanted to name. Okay, so that's how the configuration is for private link service for map to this specific workspace, okay, and the tenant, and then you can go ahead and save it and deploy it. Okay, so that's pretty much straightforward. So once you're done with that, let me get into my resource group. So I'm not going to showcase everything right from the start, because even after private link service creation and then activating it, it will take some time, right? So for 30 minutes or so to make that connection work, right? So it is already established. So in my workspace, I've already created that private link service. Let me quickly show you that. So I think it won't be visible within the resource group. You need to make sure under the manage view, you show the hidden types as well. Okay, usually I think the private link service won't be visible at the the location is actually global, as you can see here, and it will be hidden actually. Okay, so you need to show the hidden types to get to that private link service for Fabric that you just created. Okay, so you can navigate to that and you can get some information, the type of it, the private link service that you just created, and the tenant ID information and other information you can gain from here. Okay, so that's your step 2, right? So wherein you go ahead and create private link service that's mapped to your Fabric or restricted workspace. Okay, and your step 3 would be to go ahead and create your virtual network, and step 4 would be a virtual machine, so that you can then, once you done with the setup, you can log into the virtual machine and then do an nslookup to the workspace that is actually restricted, to try and see if we can resolve to private IP, right? So let's go ahead, and I think you can go ahead and create a virtual network in Azure, right? So I think it's pretty straightforward, but you need to decide on the address ranges that you would want to have it in that virtual network. So you can search for virtual network in the marketplace in Azure, and you can go ahead and create your virtual network, as you can see here, right? So in the marketplace, or you can search right on top of the search bar itself to get to the virtual network, and then go ahead and create your virtual network. Okay, so you can pick up the subscription and the region you want to have this virtual network to be created, and then the security areas and IP addresses, especially the range that you would need, right? So if you kind of choose this /2416 will give you these many addresses, and if you want to probably reduce it further with 24, that will give you 256 addresses in that specific range. So I think you can go ahead and pick the range that you want, and then go ahead and create your virtual network. Okay, and then by default it will have a separate subnet, which is a default subnet with that address. Okay, so maybe if you want to go ahead and edit further on that subnet, you can very well do that. But I think you can have probably let's say slash let me say 20, probably 22. So that will get you kind of some more address space, because the default subnet is already having /24, which is occupying 256 addresses, as you can see here. But when we deploy virtual machine under this virtual network, we will try and enable Bastion, Bastion to securely connect to that VM and showcase if you can do nslookup and things like that. So for that, I think you will need a dedicated Azure Bastion subnet. So I think for that you need to reserve some spaces, right? So that's the reason maybe you probably pick up the entire range, probably reserve some spaces, and the default subnet can hold some spaces, right? So maybe you can go ahead and edit the way you want the configuration to have the entire address range, and then decide what the subnet should hold. Maybe you can very well go ahead and even edit the address ranges here. Okay, so the way you want, but I'll leave that to you. But okay, so I'm not going to showcase that. So the virtual network is already created. Let me come back to my Fabric demos resource group, and let me show you the virtual network that we have already created, right? So let me get into the second page, and that's where my VNet 1 that I created, and let me quickly show you the address space on the left blade. Yeah, so the address range is, as you can see here, the entire address space is /16, which gets me these many addresses, just for demonstration, right? So but you need to probably make that decision how many address space that you would want in this virtual network. And also, if I can come back to subnets, there is this default subnet, which is /24, that's having around 245 IPs, and you can see here, I think I'm going to show you the Azure Bastion subnet, right? When we create that Bastion service, it will need a dedicated subnet within this virtual network to try and deploy the Bastion to securely connect to your virtual machines. Okay, so that's how you can go ahead and create your virtual network, and then probably decide on the address ranges for your the main range as well as the subnets that's going to be created. Okay, okay, so that's the step 3, I would say. Once you're done with the virtual network, you can go ahead and create your virtual machine, right? And I think you can decide on the image that you would want. Okay, so let's go ahead and try and see what are the options that we have when we try and create a virtual machine within this. And you need to make sure under the networking category or networking configuration, you pick up the virtual network that you created to effectively bring the virtual machine under the specific virtual network we created, which is VNet 1. Okay, so here you can see in the marketplace, let me go ahead and create a virtual machine, and this will be your step 4, you can say. So there are a lot of options that you need to configure to create any virtual machine, right? So you need to pick up the virtual machine name, the region, or the availability zones if you want, or if you don't want any redundancy, infrastructure redundancy, you can go ahead with that. But there are different options with respect to the storage redundancy and zone options. We can go through all of that. I'm not going to go through all of it. And the image, you can pick up the data center Azure edition, right? And you need to go ahead and provide the administrator credentials. But the key thing here is, once you're done with the disk configuration, the networking configuration is something you need to be really careful when defining that configuration, right? So you no need to go ahead and pick up or create a new virtual network and subnet, right, at the time of creation. So the VNet 1, which we have already created, that can be picked, and you can probably deploy this virtual machine within the default subnet, right? So as you can see here, it has specific address range under this virtual network. So you can go ahead and deploy your virtual machine within that virtual network, and that will pick up any kind of IP range, IP address within this range, right? It could be 10.0.0.4 or 5, whatever that might be. Within this 256 address that you're seeing here in this subnet, the virtual machine that is going to be deployed will pick up any a private IP within this range. Okay, and I think we are not going to create those public IPs and all. That's not the idea. So that's why I think Bastion will help you to securely connect using RDP port, RDP protocol, and then on the RDP port itself. Okay, so let me come back to Fabric demos and show you the virtual machine that we have already created, right? So let me just come back. So there is a test VM that I already created, and let's quickly go through the configuration. So it is of Windows Server 2022 Data Center Azure Edition, and a minimum size with 2 vCores and 4 gigs memory, located in the West US region, right? So your virtual network configuration, as you can see here, the VNet 1 and default subnet. Yeah. And then I think you can go through the other configuration here, right? So a basic configuration just to showcase. On the networking area, you can clearly see that I don't have any public IP address configured, right? So I have this private IP address allocated for this virtual machine test VM, and you can see here it took that IP from that range, right? So it allocated 10.0.0.4 as a private IP address for this virtual machine. Okay, and I think with respect to the connectivity on the left side, there's something you can connect through RDP or Bastion. I'll come to that when we are ready to validate at the end of the demo. Okay, so that will be our couple of steps. You can say step 4 and 5, wherein you go ahead and create your virtual network, and then configure the address range and subnet range, and then create your virtual machine to effectively bring that virtual machine under the virtual network, right? So just for the demonstration. Okay, so that will be your step 4 and 5. Okay, so I think we have so far seen 4 steps. I think, apologies, I mentioned it as 4 and 5. I think it was in fact step 3 and 4, where we go ahead and create a virtual network, and then creating virtual machine, and then effectively bring it under virtual network. Okay, so what our next step would be to go ahead and create a private endpoint, right? So as if you remember the architecture diagram that we discussed, right? So let me quickly revisit that. So I think so far what we have done in the architecture diagram, we restricted the access to one of the workspace that we have in Fabric, and then we created our private link servers for the specific workspace, and then we have created our virtual network and then virtual machine setting, or effectively bringing the virtual machine under the virtual network. Now the next step would be, or step 5 would be, to go ahead and create a private endpoint and map the private link servers that we have already created for workspace, the restricted workspace, which is private workspace within our Fabric tenant. Okay, so let's go back to Fabric portal, sorry, Azure portal, and then Fabric demos resource group. So the way you can go ahead and create your private endpoint, right? So you can search for private endpoint in the search bar, search for it, and you can see right under the services you have private endpoints under network foundation. So you can see I have created this private endpoint, and it is approved and in working state. But you can go ahead and create a new private endpoint, and let's go through the configuration real quick, right? So you'll pick the subscription resource group and the name of it, and then I think so let me just pick the name, whatever you want to provide. So let's say test private endpoint, and then it's going to pick up the network interface name by kind of suffixing it with NIC in the region. Okay, West US 2 or whatever that region might be, and then come back to resource, click on next resource. Okay, once I pick up the resource group, when you're creating the private endpoint, so I think resource configuration is the key here, right? So you can see there are a couple of connection methods. Connect to an Azure resource in my directory, right? So that's what we need to. So we have already created that private link service for workspace, which we need to map it now, right? So when we are creating private endpoint, that will pick up the IP address from within the range, much like the VM picked private IP within the range in virtual network. So the private endpoint is also going to pick up a specific private IP within the virtual network and then effectively bring the private link servers under the virtual network to securely connect to your workspace. Okay, and that's what we are trying to do here. And I think under the resource type, you can search for Fabric, and there you can see the type Microsoft.Fabric private link services for Fabric. Choose that, and then it's going to load the resources, right? So if you're already having some private link services created in your tenant, that's going to show up in the resource section here. Okay, so let's see what we have. So you can see here, I think the private link is showing up. Okay, under Fabric Demos Resource Group, I have this private link already created, private link services created for my workspace. If you remember the tenant ID configuration, workspace ID configuration with the JSON that we picked and configured, and we did a custom deployment. So pick up the resource, and then the target sub resource will be our workspace, right? So the target sub resource will be our Fabric workspace, and that's it. I think the resource configuration when you are creating the private endpoint is the key here, right? So you need to pick up the right resource type, then your actual private link services resource, and then the target sub resource will be a workspace. And then in the next section, virtual network, you need to make sure you pick up the existing virtual network, which you need to effectively bring this private endpoint under the virtual network, right? So which will be our VNet1 and then the default subnet. Okay, so we already have our VM sitting within this virtual network. Now we are creating this private endpoint, if you remember from the architectural diagram, to effectively map to that private link service for workspace 1, as you can see here. And this is the step we are in right now. Okay, so to effectively bring the workspace private link service right within the virtual network. Okay. And then I think you can go ahead and probably look at the DNS configuration as well to make sure. I think we kind of integrate this with the private DNS zone. You need to make sure you do that, and that is going to create a new private link private DNS zone itself. Okay, so you need to make sure we integrate to that, and the configuration name is there and subscription, and the private DNS zone that's going to be procured will be private link .fabric.microsoft.com. Okay, so those are the configurations that are required to make sure we create that private endpoint and establish that connectivity. Okay, so go ahead and create review and create your private endpoint. Okay, so but let me come back to Fabric portal, sorry, my resource group, Fabric demos under Azure portal, and let me show you the private endpoint that we have already created, right? So let's quickly look at the configuration that we have just seen. So it is the virtual network and default subnet is picked up, and the network interface created, and you can see the private link resource and target sub resource. I picked up the private link services for workspace that we have already created for this private endpoint, and the target sub resource will be my workspace. Okay, so with this, what we are doing is we are effectively bringing the workspace now within this virtual network, right? So by creating that private endpoint and then mapping it to private link resource, right? So the private link service for workspace that we have already created. Okay, so that will be a step 5, wherein we are creating this private endpoint and trying to map it to the private link service that we have already created for workspace by doing the required configuration under resource, and then picking up the virtual network to effectively bring the workspace under this specific virtual network. Well, once the private endpoint is created, so let's have a quick look at the private endpoint DNS configuration to try and understand what are the allocated IP addresses within the virtual network. If you remember, I think we looked at when we make those connection to workspaces, you need those fully qualified domain names, right? For workspace, and we have other fully qualified domain names for OneLake, then DFS, then blob storage, right? So, and for data warehouse, I think for connection strings, you need to have a different FQDN for that, right? So I think let's go back and see what are the IP address within the virtual network range that got allocated to these FQDNs, right? So you can have a look at that in the private endpoint. So I'm right within the fabric, the private endpoint that we created. As you can see, that's in the virtual network, and the private link resources attached, and the target workspaces, target sub resources workspace. On the left blade, you can see there is a DNS configuration. You click on that, and if you just scroll down, you can see there are these private IP address that got allocated from your virtual network, right from .5 till 9, which takes that workspace ID, object ID, followed by whatever the format that we have seen for OneLake workspace, and the other FQDNs that you need, that you actually require to establish the connection to your workspace, right? So that takes different IP address range, IP addresses within the actual range in your virtual network. Okay, so that's something you can quickly validate and try and understand. Okay, so if I try to, let's say the next step would be to try and validate within the virtual machine if I can do a nslookup to my workspace FQDN. It needs to resolve to this private IP address, right? So then that will be a validation or confirmation. Okay, your private endpoint configuration is working perfectly all right, and you're good to go ahead within the virtual machine to try and access the workspace programmatically through APIs, and then you're good with your further implementation or further downstream processes, right? So if you programmatically access the workspace, so that's about the private endpoint, right? Okay, so once we are done with this setup, now we are, I think, in a good position. So if you come back to your so let's quickly look at the architecture diagram again, revisit that. So now we have the entire setup ready, right? So we denied the public access for our private workspace, so there is no way, I think, we can access the workspace. As you can see, it's completely restricted from public internet, so access is restricted. And I think we had to set up the private link for our workspace, private link service for workspace, and then we created that virtual network and then virtual machine within that virtual network, and then we created private endpoint and then mapped to the resource ID for the private link service for workspace. And then we also had a look at the allocation of IP address, private IP address for this for different FQDNs that you need to make that connection, and those are allocated within the range that we already defined for that virtual network, right? So the entire setup is now ready, and the next final step would be to quickly validate by logging on to this virtual machine that we created and try and see if we can do a nslookup to the FQDN, right? So that we have right in front of us, right? So I've already copied the FQDN, so we will quickly get to log into the virtual machine with Azure Bastion service to securely connect to the VM, and then open the command prompt and then do a quick nslookup to try and see if that FQDN, right? So whatever FQDN that we looked at, this one, right? So that I'm copying it and keeping it somewhere. So if you try to do a nslookup to this FQDN, it should resolve to this private IP address, and that's the confirmation or private endpoint and private link service for Fabric Workspace is working fine, right? So that's the kind of validation we are planning to do now. Okay, now let's come back to the virtual machine, the test VM that we have. So here you can see in my Fabric demos resource group, I have all the required resources. So I've already created that service Bastion, Azure Bastion in the same region, West US. Let me open the virtual machine. Okay, so as I already mentioned, in your virtual network, right? So your VNet 1, if you go to subnets, I think you need to have that separate subnet for Azure Bastion. Okay, so that will be created. So I'll tell you how to do that quickly. So if I come back to my virtual machine, test VM, on the left blade, you see something called connection, right? So you can see there is a Bastion option, right? So you click on Bastion, and I think it will ask you to do the required configuration to deploy Azure Bastion service to securely connect and seamlessly connect using RDP and SSH protocol without the need to expose them to public IP address at all, right? So you no need to need that public IP address to establish that connection through RDP. So Bastion is a secure service that you can deploy quickly within the same virtual network. And then you can try and so when you try and deploy the Azure Bastion service within the same virtual network, it will expect a separate subnet within the VNet 1. So let me quickly show you that Bastion service that I created. So you can see here it's sitting within the same virtual network but a different subnet altogether, right? So a separate subnet has been created for that, and a public IP address has been allocated for that Bastion service, and it is right now in provisioning succeeded state. So let's go back to VM, test VM, and then the Bastion, the provisioning state is there, and the protocol is going to be RDP on 3389 port. So I'm going to authenticate to my VM. Just a moment. So at the time of creating your virtual machine, you have already provided the administrator credentials that you need to secure it somewhere to try and make that connection through Azure Bastion service to this VM. Okay, let me try and connect, and that will open a separate tab within the browser experience to try and connect to your virtual machine real quick. So let me come. Okay, so now we are within the virtual machine. As you can see here, I'm right inside my virtual machine, and this virtual machine is part of my VNet 1 virtual network, right? And we have already created private endpoint and then linked the private links service for Fabric Workspace, and then that we already verified. It took some private IP addresses for the fully qualified domain names, and we effectively brought the Fabric Workspace private link service under the same VNet 1. Okay, so now we have the complete setup ready, right? So now let me quickly do that validation what we were talking about, right? So let me open the command prompt, and then let me pick up the just a moment. So let me pick up the fully qualified domain name. Okay, let me go ahead and paste it. Okay, so let me make sure it is available in the clipboard in the VM. So you can look at the format here. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do an nslookup with the Fabric Workspace object ID. Okay, without any dashes. Very important. Because if you remember, if I come back to Fabric, the Workspace ID that you can see here is kind of having those dashes between those unique identifier, right? So I think you have to be really careful. If you're keeping along with the dashes, it's not going to resolve to private IP. It will resolve to a public IP, right? Or some other IP, public IP. No, it won't resolve to private IP. You have to this is the format, right? So you need to make sure you kind of remove the dashes in your workspace object ID, and then keep it right there, and then followed by the format Z, and then the first two from your workspace object identifier, yeah, and then followed by w.api.fabric.microsoft.com, and that's how the fully qualified domain name is that we already looked at in our private endpoint. So I think we are going to do exactly that. So let me try and paste that command, nslookup, and followed by the fully qualified domain name for your workspace, right? That we have already verified, and it should resolve to the private IP what? So let's come back. So what is that private IP which we need to resolve to in private endpoint? Let's go back to private endpoint and DNS configuration. So this is what we are trying to do, nslookup, as you can see here, the fully qualified domain name. Yeah, so let me hide this, then I think it will be a clear view, as you can see here. Okay, so this is what we are trying to do, the nslookup, and it should resolve to the private IP 10.0.0.5, and that will be the confirmation your entire setup is working fine, and you are able to securely access the Fabric Workspace from within the virtual machine sitting within the VNet 1. Okay, in your protected virtual network. So let me come back and try and do a nslookup to this FQDN, and there you go. And you can clearly see it's resolving to the private IP address 10.0.0.5, and that's the kind of validation you need to do to make sure, okay, so the private endpoint setup is perfectly working fine, and I think the entire setup is working fine. And now we are in a situation where we are completely securing the Fabric workspace from the public internet, right? So we are completely blocking that, denying the inbound public access and completely restricted. And then we enable that setup, as we talked about, with the private link servers and private endpoint to effectively bring the workspace under the virtual network. And then we logged on to the VM that is sitting within the virtual network. And then we did a nslookup to the Fabric, the workspace fully qualified domain name that we have got here with the private IP allocation, so which actually resolved to the private IP address, which is 10.0.0.5, and that confirms the entire setup is working completely all right. Okay, so I think we are at the end of the demo. So with that, I think we wrap up this video. So we have just demonstrated end-to-end and showcased how you can set up the private link service for Workspace to try and secure your Fabric workspace by denying the inbound public access and securely accessing the Fabric workspace from within the virtual network. So we have created that private link service for Workspace, and then created the required virtual network machine to try and validate. And then we created that private endpoint and then mapped it to the private link service. And then set up the we also set up the private DNS zones, required private DNS zones, and we did that end to end, and then finally validated within the VM using Azure Bastion service to try and see if we can do a nslookup to the fully qualified domain name that got allocated with the private IP, and we were able to resolve to the private IP, and that completes the entire setup that we just looked at end to end. And I hope this video is helpful. Thank you for watching, and I hope the entire video is helpful, so you can try and see if you can implement such a kind of architecture to try and protect your workspace from public internet by completely denying the public access, and then set up the private link service and private endpoint within your virtual network to securely access the Fabric workspace. So please feel free to share this with your network, and subscribe to our channel for more such interesting, insightful videos. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in another video. Thank you.